Hi, in this video we're going to look at creating a Hello World application using Xcode 3 and also add a little bit of interactivity with a button. So I'm going to open up Xcode. I'm just going to create a new Xcode project. And for my new project, I'm going to make sure I have iOS application selected. And I'm going to choose a view-based application and make sure my product is set for iPhone. And I'm going to click choose. And so now I'm going to give my project a name. So I'm just going to do Hello World. And find a location on your computer and save it. And then I have my Xcode window open and I'm just going to set up my screen a little bit. Stretch this out so we have a little room. And I'm going to collapse this area of the files so I have more room over here for demonstrating my code. So I'm just going to go to View and Zoom Editor in. Now one of the first places that I like to start is with setting up my interface, what it's going to look like with the buttons and any text fields and things of that nature. So as we work in here, we're going to be working in our classes folder, and we'll be working with, in this lesson, the Hello World View Controller H file and the Hello World View Controller M file. And we'll be working a lot with the user interface, which is available in the resources folder, in particular the Hello World View Controller. Now you can see this Hello World View Controller has the same name almost exactly as the Hello World View Controller M and Hello World View Controller H file. These three files are connected to each other. This is an interface builder file, XIB, it's also said nib file or zib file. And this is where we'll create our user interface. And then the header file is our class definition file, where we're going to define the things like instance variables and methods that our class will use. And then the implementation file is where we say exactly what should be happening with our class. So I'm going to start by opening up my Hello World View Controller nib file by double clicking on it. And that's going to start Interface Builder. Now Interface Builder has a lot of different window panels with it in Xcode 3. Xcode 4 has a more streamlined user interface, but for now we're working with Xcode 3. So I'm just going to tile my windows next to each other so that they're all right here and easy to see. Now I'm going to start by populating my view with some user interface elements from the library. So I'm going to scroll down, and in this library list I'm going to find the label. So I'm going to click and drag a label onto my view, and then I'm going to drag a rounded rectangle button onto my view. Now when I do that, I'm actually creating an instance of a class. Apple and Xcode give us classes that we can use and start to implement into our applications without a lot of coding. So by clicking and dragging the button onto the view, I've instantiated a UI button class. So there's a whole class dedicated to working with buttons and the things that they can do, like what they look like and how they're clicked and their functionality. If I click on the label view, select in the library over here, label. At the bottom of the library, it gives you a little description about each of these elements. And I can see that this is a UI label class. So by dragging a label onto my view, I've instantiated a UI label class object. So we can work with these things in our code, and that now gives us access to all of the methods and properties that are part of the UI label class. To begin with, I'm just going to expand this to give myself some more room. So I have this, and to do a little bit of formatting, you can work with the attributes panel here. Like if I wanted my text to be centered, I can play around with fonts and sizes and colors and things of that nature. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as the default. For button, I'm just going to double click on the text here and put in what I want my button to say. So this is going to be Hello World. So the goal for this is to, when we click on Hello World, we're going to change the text that's in the label. So I don't want label to show up on my screen initially, so I'm just going to remove that. So now when I click off of it, it looks like it's gone, it's disappeared. But if I mouse my cursor over that area, it turns into a little hand, so you can see I'm in an area where I can go back and to select it. You can also double check the layout and elements in your view by going to the document window. This is the document window, and it's the one that we have Files Owner, First Responder, and then View. And you can look at this in different views. There's a View Mode button up here, and right now I'm in the center where we have the list, and we can see this in large icons, and then we can see this in a columnar view. I find the first two to be the most useful, and this center column also lets me expand this to see more information about what's included within the view. So now that I have my user interface set up, I'm going to make sure I save my file, because if you don't save and you go to build and run and test it in the simulator, you won't see the changes or the updates. So you have to remember to in Xcode 3 especially, to save each file as you work with it. So now what we need to do is to go in and set this up in our class files. So we need to go into our view controller header file and say that this is a UI label and what we're going to call it. We're going to give it an instance variable name. And then we're going to connect this button to a method so that when it is clicked, it's going to go out and find this label and put some text into it. So we'll come back to Interface Builder after we've added some code into our class files and make the connection between what we have on our interface and the code that we're writing. So I'm going to switch back to Xcode, and I'm going to go into the Hello World View Controller header file. And this is where we define the elements that are in our interface. And you can see here, this is referring to our interface. So we have, in our view, we have what's called an IB outlet, Interface Builder Outlet. And this is something that we're going to be changing or modifying or referring to in our code. So we have an outlet, and it's a type of UI label. And now when we drag that onto our view, we created an instance of that UI label. And now we're going to give it a name. We're going to make it an instance variable, and so it needs a name. And so we use an asterisk to define, or actually it's creating a pointer to where that will be in memory. So let's say my label. And you may see this asterisk. It's acceptable to write it in different formats. And so I'm just going to show you quickly some of the ways that you might see it written. I tend to put it right in front of the variable name, the instance variable name, so that to me it's clear that this is what it's modifying. But you may see it listed like this. You might also see it listed right next to something like UI label, the class name. So those are all valid ways of listing it. So I just wanted to point that out in case you're reading other examples and you see it listed different ways, you don't get confused. So here we are defining and saying this is, we have a UI label that's in our interface builder, and it's an outlet, and we're calling it my label. So now we need to give it some properties. So I'm going to say property non-atomic retain, and these are attributes of property, and basically this is describing how memory management is going to be handled. And we're not going to cover that in this video. That's a whole different topic in itself. But the properties that we're going to create are for our IB outlet, the UI label, the name, my label. So I'm going to copy and paste that right after my property. We've created this instance variable, given it a name, and assign it to properties. And now to complete that cycle, we need to synthesize it. So we actually synthesize it in the view controller implementation file. So I'm going to switch over here, and I'm going to, right after the implementation line, we're going to synthesize, and we're going to put in the name of what we're synthesizing. So that completes that whole cycle and makes my label a property now that will be available to us in our implementation file. This is also making a space for it in memory. So when we are synthesizing it, Xcode is allocating space for it in memory. And in Xcode 3, we have to manage our own memory. So since we're synthesizing it, I'm going to scroll down to the very end of my implementation file. And there's a dealloc method, which is to deallocate things from memory. So I'm just going to add in here my label, and I'm going to say release. And this will release it from memory. So that's the whole cycle for our label. We defined it in our interface as an IB outlet and gave it the name myLabel. We're assigning it as a property, how memory is going to be managed. And once we have this set up with properties, we actually complete the process by synthesizing it in our implementation file. And now we'll be able to access the properties and methods of myLabel, which means in turn we're able to access the methods and properties of myLabel, which are coming from the UI label class. And then the last thing we did was, since we put it into memory, we have to release it from memory, so we deallocate it in the dealloc method. All right, one other thing we need to set up in here is our button, right? In Interface Builder, our button is going to cause an action that's going to change the text in the label. So we need to specify in our header file that we're going to have an action. And we do that by saying IB action. That's for Interface Builder action. So this means that something in Interface Builder is going to fire off or start this action. And so let's just say button tapped. And we're dealing with elements like this. It can be useful to include ID sender, which means we'll be able to access the value or the information of what in Interface Builder, whether it's a button or a switch or a segmented control, we'll be able to access information from the element that started this action. That's often useful to include when something is coming from Interface Builder. So I'm going to include that in here and save. Now I have everything set up in my header file, my class file, and I'm going to go back into Interface Builder and make the connection so that we can see that this label is connected to this label, which is invisible right now. So once we've defined these elements in our header file, and again, make sure this is saved before we come back into Interface Builder and try to make the connections, otherwise it won't recognize it. File's owner contains information about our label. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. So I'm going to right click and drag from File's owner, and I'm going to point to the label. And when I release it, it shows us the available outlets. Now we only have one, and if we had defined several, you'd be able to see a list of all of them. But here we're actually making the physical connection to say File's owner has information about this label, and we want to assign this particular label to myLabel. And now if you want to double check and see how that has been set up, I'm going to right click on it, and you can see that now, yes, File's owner, it is connected to myLabel in File's owner. Now if you did the wrong thing by mistake, you can just come in here and delete that, and now it's not connected to anything. And then I can come back in here and reconnect it. So if you happen to do it to the wrong thing. Our Hello World button is going to start or fire a method that's in File's owner. So I'm going to right click and drag, and it's helpful to select the element first, then right click and drag, and I'm going to go to Files Owner, because Files Owner has the method that we want to run when this button is clicked. So when I release, you can see the available events, and there's only one. So we want this to fire off the button tapped event. And again, I can right click on my button and I can double check and see that it was connected. Now the typical event for a button is touch up inside. So that means when the touch up inside event happens to this button, it's going to go to Files Owner and find the button tapped method and then run whatever that method says to do. I'm going to make sure I save my file in Interface Builder. And I'm going to switch back to Xcode. And we've got everything set up in the header file, but we need to fill out a little bit more information about this button tapped method. We need to define in our implementation file exactly what should happen when this method occurs. So I'm going to copy this without the semicolon, and I'm going to go to the implementation file, and right up after my synthesize statement, I'm just putting it up here because it'll keep it all together. I'm going to paste that line in, and we're going to turn this into a function or a method by putting in the curly braces. Now let's just start by doing what's called a log statement. We just want to print something out to the console so that we can see that the button, when it's tapped, is getting into this method. So I'm going to type in NSLog, and it takes a string format in here. So I'm just going to put in a little statement. We start it with an @ double quote, and then the text. So I'm going to say button was tapped, and close this, end it with a semicolon. So hopefully what should happen is if everything is connected, when we tap the button and we run our console, we should see a message that says button was tapped. So I'm going to make sure everything is saved, and I'm going to do a build and run. I can go up here and do it. I tend to use the icon up here. And you can see it goes through the build, and it shows succeeded. If you had errors, they would show up here. If you had warnings, you would have little yellow warning signals here. And my simulator has opened. And now when I tap this, I don't see anything else happening in my simulator, so you might think something's going wrong. But we need to open up the simulator. So I'm going to click back in Xcode, and we go to Run Console to bring up the console. And you can see now my button was tapped messages that were showing up. So I'm going to clear the log just so that I can have this, and I'll bring up my simulator again. And now as I tap this, you'll see the NSLog statement showing up in the console. So using that NSLog statement can be helpful to see if, especially if you have a lot of complicated code that's going on here, and you want to see whether it's actually getting into this method. You can put in an NSLog statement just to see whether it's actually getting that far. So that can be a helpful debugging and troubleshooting tool. So we know now that when we tap this, it is firing off the button tapped method. So now we can start to include some other code in here. So I'm going to just comment this out. And now what I really wanted to do is I wanted to find that label called my label and put some text into it. So let's add some code that will do that. So I can start to say, well, I want to refer to my label. And as I do, since it has been synthesized, it recognizes it as an instance variable, and now it's a property. So I can use the properties that are available as part of the UI label class. And one of them happens to be text, mylabel.text. And I'm going to say equals, and we'll do a text string in here. So just like we had the text string in our NSLog statement, it's going to be the same format, the @ symbol, double quote. That's basically how Objective-C works with strings like this. So we have hello world, and let's just be really clever and say good night moon. and close it with a semicolon. So now if I save this, and I'm going to stop running my hello world that's in the simulator now, and if you forget to do this and you build and run again, what will happen is it'll pop up and say you want to stop what's already running because there's already something running. So I'll click OK, and I'm going to have my simulator pop open, and when I tap my hello world button, there is my text string. So that's an overview of a basic hello world with a little bit of interactivity and learning how to make the connections between the elements that you have in your user interface and setting things up in your code.